Compared to gardeners, farmers need to take much more into account when they decide on their crop rotation. The aspects that I mention here are things that you can consider when you want to design your own crop rotation, but most of the time you won't have to take them into account. Maybe first and foremost is the experience a farmer has with a certain crop. If a farmer has more expertise in a certain crop, he is less likely to run into unknown difficulties and problems, and therefore runs a lower risk of crop loss. For obvious reasons, experience and tradition often go hand in hand. A second consideration is revenue. Some crops have a much higher return than other crops have, and a farmer will prefer higher profitable crops. For example, in the Netherlands, the gross revenue for seed potatoes is approximately €8,000, whereas the gross revenue for wheat is approximately €1,100. Unfortunately, the cultivation of high-quality seed potatoes requires prodigious skill, a suitable soil, and the right maritime climate. Directly linked to revenue is market demand and location relative to transport and its buyers. A farmer will only produce those crops which he expects to be able to sell later in the year, for which also its location can be quite important. For instance, when a farmer is located relatively close to a factory that makes food preserves, it will often be able to sell its vegetables to the factory. Of course, it's often also the other way around. The factory will settle in a specific location due to the specific vegetables that are produced there. Next to market demand is the available mechanization a farmer has. Many crops require specific machines to grow and harvest them efficiently. As some machines cost up to $500,000, it is often easier to specialize in a limited number of crops. Another solution can be, for example, to share farm equipment with neighbors. Directly linked to available mechanization is the labor requirement and the labor distribution. Very few crops have an even labor requirement during the entire year. Many crop farmers will be very busy during the spring and the autumn, while it can be relatively quiet during the winter season. At the same time, some crops require much more labor than the others do, and when labor is scarce and already very unevenly distributed, it's often smart to grow crops that require just a little labor or crops that are planted and harvested at a different moment in time. Also linked to the mechanization is the farmer's desire to preserve his soil. As already mentioned in the previous chapter, often when multiple root crops are grown in concession, and when they are harvested by heavy machines or the soil is wet for instance, the soil can compact and it will become very difficult for water and oxygen to get through. Especially in clay soils, the soils most susceptible to this kind of damage, this can be visible by the soil forming a blue layer below ground. Something that I didn't mention earlier is that structural decay will also have a negative effect on the diseases in your soil. Diseases such as Arrhenia are known to occur more often when the soil is compacted. As mentioned earlier, farmers need to control the weeds on their land, and crop rotation can be a very useful tool to do that. Just like in vegetable gardens, a farmer can grow dense crops or open crops, thereby influencing the weeds that emerge. However, most farmers can also control weeds by chemical means, by using herbicides. Many herbicides, however, are only partially selective of the weeds they control, often also influencing the crop that is grown. The more different the weed is from the crop, the less specific the herbicide needs to be to only target the weeds. Poaceae, for instance, the grasses, and Alliaceae, the leeks, are both monocot crops, which is an entirely different clade than the other crops, the eudicots, also known as the broadleaf plants. Because of this, it is often easier to control monocot weeds like grass in eudicot crops, and vice versa, to control eudicot weeds in monocot crops. Linked to weeds is the use of cover crops. Cover crops cover the soil during the winter and bind the nutrients, preventing them from eroding while at the same time adding some extra organic matter to the soil. A good cover crop or crop mixture will do all these things while at the same time not enhancing the amount of harmful pests and diseases present. For this to happen, the cover crop needs to adhere to all the rules the other crops need to adhere to. Namely, it is preferred that they belong to a different family than the other crops in the crop rotation. Some crops, such as French marigolds, can even actively reduce the amount of specific pests in the soil. However, this is something that is very pest and crop specific and is not discussed further in this course. Last, and certainly not least, is legislation and regulations. When talking about legislation and regulations, we should make a distinction between the regulations enforced by the government and regulations a farmer can adhere to comply with certain quality standards. Let's first look at legislation and regulations by the government. Most countries have certain rules a farmer needs to follow. The amount of influence government regulations have on the crop rotation can be very location specific. So let's present the Netherlands as a case study here. In the Netherlands, it is not allowed by law to grow seed potatoes once a potato cyst nematode, Glabridera rostogiensis or Glabridera pallida, has been found. The plot of land is registered, and only when the plot has been declared free is it possible to grow seed potatoes again. This rule is to prevent the disease from being spread further and to protect our export position. Other countries have similar rules on which crops can be grown and which crops cannot be grown. For instance, whether or not it's allowed to grow GMO crops can vary from country to country, thereby influencing the potential crop rotation. On the other hand, there are regulations a farmer can choose to adhere to in order to comply with quality standards. Producing with an organic label is one of these quality standards, which can have an enormous impact on the crop rotation of a farmer. As mentioned earlier, the prevention of pests, diseases and weeds is one of the two main reasons for crop rotation. While all farmers have to deal with pests and diseases, conventional farmers can use pesticides and herbicides to directly control these weeds. Organic farmers, on the other hand, have much less direct control and need to collaborate with nature rather than work against it or force it to work with them. Because of this, many conventional farmers can use crop rotation of 1-on-3, sometimes even 1-on-2 or 1-on-1, while the organic farmer often needs a crop rotation of 1-in-6 and sometimes even more. Although these considerations are mostly for farmers, it doesn't mean that you should not take them into account when you want to. I myself, for instance, prefer to grow crops that are not present in the local supermarket, like Swiss chard, and crops that have a very good return on investment, like zucchinis. Now that you know most, if not all things to take into consideration, it is time to look at how to design your own crop rotation schedule. This is done in the next section.